And my best friend Todd was coming over every day, and we would do heroin. And I was also taking a ton of Xanax at the time. I think I was hungry or he was hungry, and we were like, let's get some Mexican food. So we call up the Mexican place, and we're watching 90210 and smoking weed and doing heroin. And then all of a sudden, I like I shoot a bag and I like fall out. And he thought I OD'd and died. And at the same time, there's a knock on the door, and Todd's like, oh, and he freaks out and he starts running around the apartment, like doesn't know what to do because he thinks I'm dead in the back room. And now who's at the door? And he opens the door, and as he opens the door, he faints. He just opens the door to our apartment and he faints. And when he faints, I come to. And I come to, and then I see Todd on the ground in the doorway, and standing over him is this Mexican guy. And I'm like, what the fuck happened? And then I see the Mexican guy, has a bag of food, and he's wearing, a restaurant kind of outfit. And I was like, oh yeah, we got Mexican food.
Dave has a plethora of stories that are equally hilarious, outrageous, and heart-wrenching. From being a waiter at one of the world's most famous delis, to launching and developing the Dopey podcast, to tragically losing his best friend and co-host Chris. Dave has had a wild ride and he ain't done yet. What's up, everybody? My name's Dan, and this is Hard Knocks Talks, your mental health podcast. Make sure you stick around to the end where Dave shares some tips on getting through the Christmas season sober, and there's a bonus story too. What's up, Dave?
What's up, Dan?
How are you today? Thanks for joining me.
I am very well. It's a pleasure to be on the Hard Knocks Talks podcast after all this time.
Is there anything that you'd like to say before we jump in today?
I want to say that I'm feeling good, and that I'm happy to be here, and that I'm a Jewish person who loves the holidays. And Dan has a big Christmas plan, so ignore the fact that Jesus Christ is not my personal savior, but I love Christmas.
You know what? He's not mine either. So having said that, let's go.
This is Hard Knocks Talks.
All right, if you are struggling with the substance use of a loved one or have tragically lost someone to drug-related harms, reach out to Stronger Together Canada peer-led support groups by Mums Stop the Harm. If you are in search of a private inpatient addictions treatment, check out Prairie Sky Recovery Centre located in Leipzig, Saskatchewan. And the Elizabeth Fry Society of Saskatchewan covers all associated costs for women or gender-diverse individuals to apply for criminal record suspension. Reach out to Chelsea at 306-668-0653 to make contact or learn more about today's sponsors. Check out our new merch, or if you want to show us some love and buy us a coffee, all those links are in the show notes below. The life of a Dave. Now, did you grow up around a lot of substance use? Is that something that was normal for you at home?
No. I grew up in a middle-class Jewish household in New York City. My parents were both teachers. There was no substance abuse or use in my house. My dad might drink a beer when he ate spaghetti, but he wouldn't drink more than a beer. My sister dabbled with drugs as a teenager, but I didn't know about it until I was a teenager. And at that point, that's kind of when it started, But it was very middle of the road, middle class New York City kind of thing where I grew up.
What was it like the first time you got loaded? Were you like scared? Was there any talk at home like, don't do drugs are bad? Or was this like a completely like, what is this moment?
It's funny, there was no talk. No talk. First time I got loaded was alcohol, and I was a waiter at a camp in Massachusetts. It was one of the worst summers of my life. And the way alcoholics kind of describe feeling alone, right? Like lonely, not like disenfranchised. That camp, I was totally alone, and I found a new level of sort of depression and isolation. And the last night of the year, the kitchen staff, who are mostly English, threw a party, And I went to the party. I was probably 15 years old, and I probably drank 16 screwdrivers, and I blacked out. And I somebody had to hold me up in the shower, and I vomited, and that was the first time. And then I didn't get drunk like that again, maybe ever. And I kind of discovered that I couldn't drink. But shortly after that, I got really interested in weed, and I really fell in love with weed,
Mm.
deeply and significantly in love with weed, and that was a real. I would never call it a gateway drug, but it was totally an entry point into my
Mm-hmm.
addiction. And then I was really into rock and roll. I was really into like the Beatles and like the idea of like drug culture. And I started to take psychedelics, and then I would take amphetamines, and then like I think there were Quaaludes around when I was in college. We took a bunch of those, and
Wow,
then
you're really
like
dating yourself now.
I don't know how there were
Mm-hmm.
like I talked to guests about Quaaludes, and I remember we had some kind of supply of lemons, and that they were
Yeah.
like Quaaludes that we called lemons. I don't like I did so many drugs that I don't remember a lot of my story in
Mm-hmm.
like real cohesive kind of ways. But I think there was a Quaalude section, and then I wound up transferring colleges, and I did heroin for the first time. I transferred into an art school. I did heroin with this kind of pseudo rock star, and I got real sick, and I was like, I'm just going to stick with weed. But then a few years later, I was just fucking around. You know what I mean? Once you're a real stoner, like once I was a real stoner, and I mean like an everyday stoner, I
Yeah.
was open to anything. And
Yeah.
eventually I wound up totally addicted to heroin and benzos.
So was there ever any times where you did dumb shit that ended you up in stints of sobriety? Like was like, I'm done, and then you actually quit for a while, or was it just all balls to the wall?
No, I never had any, like I wouldn't even have a day. Like I started when I was probably a freshman. I mean, I smoked weed before I was a freshman in college, but I remember one day freshman year in college, I was with a new friend, and I said, and we were in a band, and I said, I'm going to smoke weed every day. And I probably smoked weed every day from 18 to 40, unless I was in treatment. And then I added drugs on it. And I always used kind of my stoner dumb, and I'd apply it to whatever other drug I was doing like that. And that's probably why I became such a horrible drug addict. But no, I never had any time. And once and that's how I am. Like I'm just a real all or nothing kind of person. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
I was just describing to you, Dan, that I've put out Dopey for 441 weeks in a row. It's just my nature is I just am fucking all in. That's just
Mm-hmm.
how I am. And
Yeah.
I remember like once I started making a little bit of money, was doing heroin a few days a week, and I don't know how I thought I could afford to do heroin every day. But I remember thinking I could afford it, but that was a dumb thought.
What were you? Okay, you started making some money. What were you doing to make money?
I was producing a TV show. I was hosting a TV show and producing a TV show.
Shit, so you come
And
by this naturally then, like this whole podcaster thing. This is something that you've sort of like worked into. This isn't just like me. I was a welder, and then one day I was like, I got a laptop. I'm going to do a podcast. It was always like, who the fuck said that? So just
no,
saying.
yeah, like I had a vision to be a talk show host when I was a teenager. And when I was in high school, I was actually on MTV. Like I had an
Wow.
internship at MTV, and I wound up being on MTV. And then I wound up getting a job as a production assistant for a little uh, crew. And then I got a production assistant job for another TV company. And I wound up producing a little show for Lorne Michaels, who did Saturday Night Live, owned a
Mm-hmm.
company called Broadway Video, and Broadway Video bought this company called Burly Bear Network. And Burly Bear Network was basically a college cable network. And I got hired to produce some stuff, but then they thought I was funny, so they let me host a bunch of stuff. And then I made a music show there, and I got to interview a lot of like famous rock stars and stuff, and that's kind
Okay.
of when I became a heroin. It was in that period.
Was the rock stars in your proximity a direct player in your discovery and accelerated use of heroin?
Definitely not.
No.
It was no, definitely not. Like I was a kid. I
Mm-hmm.
was like 24, and I'd go interview like Ween or something, and I would get loaded, and I would go out to Long Island, and Ween would be loaded, but we wouldn't have gotten loaded together. You know what I mean? Or like I would interview like Bob Weir from the Grateful Dead, but it's not like we were getting high together. I interviewed a
Mm.
lot of rock stars who were high. I never got high with any of them.
You got high
Um,
before.
yeah, yeah,
That's crazy. So a lot of the interviews, a lot of the work that you did in production, all of that, you were high on heroin the whole time.
the whole time. I became a heroin addict when I would do that stuff. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about the quality of Dopey was because when I was a kid, I interviewed a lot of my heroes, like Bob Weir, like Ween, like KRS-One, like who did I interview? The Flaming Lips, like all these bands from the '90s. This guy Junior Brown, this great guitar player. Uh, fucking Eric EPMD, which is a great hip hop group from back then. I interviewed a bunch of like people that I loved, and I didn't prepare in the slightest.
Mm.
And when I got the opportunity to do Dopey, I decided I was never going to do an interview unprepared again. And so half of Dopey is just about preparing, 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 preparing.
Mm.
Um, but back in those days, like I interviewed this very very famous rapper named KRS-One. That was the first on camera interview I had done, and I was stoned, but I wasn't on heroin. Uh, and I was so excited that it wound up being good. And
Mm.
but excitement can only carry you so far. You know what
Mm-hmm.
I mean? And I was a
Mm-hmm.
kid.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but basically, as my career, and I'm talking about between the ages of 22 and 25, in that little pocket, I I produced, I don't know, 50 shows, that came out once a month, or I don't remember how the shows were released or anything. But by the I got a contract. It was the '90s, and
Mm-hmm.
I got a contract where I was getting 80 grand a year, 90 grand a year, 100 grand a year when I was 22.
Well, in the
And I
90s,
was
that was
like,
still something too.
I've made it big. I'm rich and famous is what I was neither rich nor famous.
Mm-hmm.
But that's when I decided I could afford heroin. And as soon as I decided it, everything I did sucked. Like I looked horrible. I sounded horrible. I didn't come to work all the time. I came to work late. I had a terrible attitude. I was a jerk. Um, and that was just the very beginning, of my heroin addiction. I
Mm-hmm.
wound up losing the gig because I got so strung out that I was in low income housing in New York City. I was paying like $300 a month. I was making $80,000 a year, and I couldn't afford my apartment, and I had to go to detox. And it's kind of like I had this moment where I had to decide, was I going to tell my boss or was I going to tell my parents? And I decided to tell my parents, and my boss was like, "We can finally fire this guy because he breached contract,"
Mm.
and that was a big mistake. And then after that happened, I lost the job. I wound up getting another high-end production job at MTV. I made a special at MTV. I directed Jason Schwartzman. He was like the kid in Rushmore. He was
Mm-hmm.
in Darjeeling Limited. I don't know if you know Jason Schwartzman. He's
I.
uh he, he's a pretty famous actor.
Mm-hmm.
And I directed him, and I was wasted on heroin for that. It was fucking horrible. I did that job. I literally, the last day of the job, I walked around the floor of MTV, which is on 1515 Broadway. And back then in MTV, if you walked around there, every desk in there, and there's hundreds of desks, are covered with CDs. that the record companies give to anybody that works there. I took 5 shopping bags, I filled them up with everyone's CDs, and I left there stealing every CD I could get. I went down to St. Mark's Place in New York City and I sold them all. They never hired me again. And that was kind of the beginning of the end of my career and the
Hmm.
beginning of my serious, horrible drug addiction.
Did you find yourself homeless? Did you find yourself still looking for more work? Like, because for me, it came to a place where I'm like, screw the man, I'm not working anymore. And I tried to start a recycling company, and I was just basically digging in dumpsters to buy dope. So that's how it went for me, from welding company to near homelessness.
I always say that I was too bougie to ever be homeless. Like if I didn't have cable TV, I don't think I would have kept a habit. Like I think I would have gotten clean. if I had had if I had had real hard times, I think I would have gotten sober way earlier.
Hmm.
And I didn't come from money. I just would figure out ways to kind of pull it off, you know?
Hmm.
Like in the beginning I got fat unemployment, you know. I got fat unemployment and my apartment was so cheap and my parents enabled me a bit. You know,
Hmm.
like they would throw the $300 towards my rent or something, you know, when I was a kid.
Hmm.
And then my heroin addiction was so bad, um, and so obvious to everybody that they were like, "You need to go away and get help." So we didn't have any money. I got a scholarship to a treatment center in Florida, and I went to Florida to long-term treatment. And I didn't want to get sober, but I knew that I couldn't survive.
Hmm.
And the treatment center convinced my parents to not pay my rent, my $300 a month rent. That I also need to tell you, like, I grew up in low income housing. My
Hmm.
mother put me on the list for my apartment when I was 11. I got it when I was 21. You know, I waited 10 years to get that apartment.
That's some
And
foresight.
it was, but as soon as I went to rehab, they convinced my parents to not pay for it. So then
Mm.
I was kind of like, I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't want to get sober. I didn't want to live in Florida. Uh, and I worked at a furniture moving company and I got a plane ticket and I moved to Los Angeles. I had friends living in LA. And I got there intent on being a stoner. But when I showed up there, my best friend had just discovered crystal meth, and I was like, okay. And I kind of knew as soon as I did it that I wasn't going to be a crystal meth person, but I
Mm.
also knew that I couldn't handle getting up like that without seeking out benzos and heroin. So I
Mm.
wound up totally strung out in Los Angeles in their house. I got another kind of decent production job there working on a TV show, which I lost almost instantaneously. And
Mm.
then I convinced my ex girlfriend to move and be with me. And we got an apartment, and she paid for it for the next 5 years in LA.
Wow.
And
So,
that's how I got by.
you mentioned that your parents enabled you a bit. What was that conversation like? You're talking to your parents, and oh, I lost my job. Like, were you lying to them? Were you telling them the truth? Like, what did that conversation sound like with your parents at that time?
I think I was a pretty masterful liar before I ever did heroin.
Mm.
Like when I was a kid, I would have friends come over, and my friends would always say to me, I can't talk to your parents because I don't know what lie you're going to tell them, and I don't want
Mm.
to contradict whatever you say. So like I was a total liar. I lied about anything I could as often as I could. And I just came up with shit. And I mean they knew I had gotten fired, but they had also known that I had to go to detox. You know, like they didn't really we didn't understand what addiction was going to look like. We did
Mm.
not have a roadmap out. They never had dealt with anything like it.
Mm.
Um and they just did their best.
When did it start to become a thought in your head that maybe drugs aren't going to work out for me?
It didn't. I did not have that thought. I was totally committed to using, and I used um straight. Like I wanted to want to stop.
Mm.
And I never wanted to stop smoking pot. Like when
Mm-hmm.
I got to LA, it became clear that when I moved in with my girlfriend, I wasn't going to be able to afford heroin. So I got on methadone, and I would still buy heroin, and I would shoot as much heroin as I could before I would get my dose for the day. And I would buy benzos every day, and I would steal the money from my girlfriend. The only job I had in LA, I worked at a weed dispensary, and I had them pay me in pot. I was like the security guard at a weed dispensary, and I was high on heroin. I was the worst. I was the worst security guard a weed dispensary could ever have.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had other really horrible jobs that I did not last at, and but I never wanted to get so sobriety was not on my radar. I kind of wanted to not be a heroin addict. I kind of wanted to be a stoner. I
Mm.
wanted to I wanted to stay high. Like I was neurotic, I was anxious, I was fearful, and I loved drugs to keep me from being those things.
Did you
So
ever
like
ask?
so I wasn't interested in sobriety
Yeah.
until honestly until like way later until we had I'd gotten with this other woman and she had gotten pregnant and we had a kid. And
Mm.
that's when I was a little interested in sobriety and I still wasn't really interested. I wasn't really interested in sobriety until I got sober, to be totally honest with you. I was not interested. Like I didn't want it until
Mm-hmm.
I got it. Like
If you didn't want it, why did you get sober?
I was so at the point of getting sober. I was 41. So we're skipping over many, 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 many years of idiocy, and addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother died, and me and the girlfriend broke up, and I wound up with this other woman, and she got pregnant, and I was getting high. Um, and then I was trying to lie my way through that, and I found that I wanted recovery when it became obvious that I couldn't care for my daughter. And when
Mm.
it became obvious that I couldn't use and care for my daughter. And when I say that, I couldn't use anything and be the father that I wanted to be. Cuz at
Mm.
the end I wasn't doing heroin. I was taking pills very rarely. I was smoking weed after work. But I even in that mode, which was functional functional
Mm.
addict, I knew that I couldn't be the person that I wanted to be in order to be the father that she deserved. And the person really wasn't about her as much as I didn't want to look at myself and hate myself that I was a child at 41 with a child. And
Mm.
that's when I wanted to get sober.
What was it like entering recovery? Did you go to treatment? Did you like go to the rooms? Did you go to what did that look like?
I had gone to treatment. I had gone to treatment because I had relapsed on heroin, like to a major level. Like I
Mm.
was I was shooting like $300 a day for a year or something, and I was a total train wreck. And I would come visit my. I always paid my child support, and
Mm.
I always did my visitation, even if I was wasted. You know.
Mm.
So I think what happened was I went to treatment and I came back and I still didn't really want to be sober. I didn't really want to be sober when I got sober. I mean, I remember I had one of those moments where I was writing my daughter's mother and begging her for permission to let me smoke weed and have parent rights. And I remember I'm sitting in an apartment on the Lower East Side of New York City, and I'm just like, what the fuck am I doing? Like, how is this the end of my run that
Mm.
like who am I, like how is this my life? And I kind of had that moment where I was like 41 with a child. I think our daughter was 4 at that point,
Mm.
and I was just like, how am I begging to smoke weed? Like and then I went to a 12-step meeting the next day,
Mm.
and I went to a 12-step meeting, and there was a kid who was celebrating 10 years. at the 12-step meeting, and the kid was probably 27. And I was like, and he's like covered in tattoos, and he was really handsome. And I was like, who's this fucking kid? And
Mm.
I went up to him at the end of the meeting, and I was like, I wanted to tell him how annoying he was, that he had 10 years and was so young and successful.
And nice
And
tattoos.
yeah, he was just like he was a kid with his shit together, and I was a 41-year-old, and I was a total mess. And he was very nice to me, even though I was a total jerk off to him. And
Mm.
he said, "Oh, how many days do you have?" And I said, "I have today." And he goes, "Oh, wow, so today can be your first day." And I'm like, kind of annoyed that he said that. And
Yeah.
then I was like, well, maybe it could be, and then I went home and I called a couple friends, and I had them come over, and I gave them all of my weed. And I had jars and jars of bud and edibles and all that shit. And I gave them all of that stuff. And then I found another meeting the next morning at 7:30 in the morning, in Chinatown in New York, which was very close to where I lived. And I went there, and I kind of talked about where I was at and how much I wanted my family back, and how upset I was at myself. And there was a guy in the meeting who said, "We'd love it if you came back tomorrow." And I was like, "Wow, that's interesting." And I went back the next day, and that meeting met 7 days a week at 7:30 in the morning. And I was and I still am, a natural early riser, and I never had anything to do. So
Mm.
to have the ability to go to this place, was great. And I think probably the second or the third day going, I had this thought, which was, I'm 41. If I'm lucky, I'll live to be 82, and this can be half of my life, and I've used basically all of it, all of my adolescent adult years. And I have a waiter job at a deli and a subletted apartment. What could recovery look like? And that moment was the first moment I probably said, I want to see what life without drugs would be like.
Did in that moment, did a weight pile on or did a weight come off?
I was just open for the first time. So
Mm.
maybe a weight came off. I was
Mm.
open to something different, and I
Mm.
hadn't been since ever. So
Mm.
being open was, you can call it a weight was lifted, but really my view expanded, and I was like, wait a sec, I could do something totally different. and
Mm-hmm.
and, and that's what happened.
So what did that look like then when you said I could do something different? What did that first different thing look like? Was that just like going to meetings? Like did you what did it look like?
Oh, it was strictly meetings.
Yeah.
There's a reading called How It Works.
Oh
And in
yes.
How It Works, it says, rarely have we seen someone thoroughly follow this path and not achieve these results. And I knew that I had never thoroughly done fucking anything except used.
Mm.
And then they did promises, and I was like, you gotta be kidding me.
Oh
But
yes, they
I,
come true before you're halfway through.
but I never believed in anything like that. But at the same time, I was crazy desperate. So I decided that I was going to do it to the best of my ability, because I never had before.
Mm-hmm.
And I did, and it totally worked.
Hmm.
Totally worked. And that's basically my whole story. I never used again. I started Dopey 4 months later, like that, and that was it.
Like tell me what it was like when you first envisioned the podcast. Like what did the for me, the name came to me and it felt like it came from somewhere else. And like when it was presented to me, the name of my podcast, like it made me cry. And I felt like finally, like I've got this thing that I can use to make sense of all of the bullshit that happened to me, use it for good instead of continuing to lie and be deceitful and all of these things. What was it like for you the first time you hit record?
Well, I had been working at this deli, this very, very, very famous deli in New York City, for a while, probably for, oh God, 7 years. I had been working there, and I had become a waiter there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like one of the most famous restaurants in the world, really. Have you ever seen When Harry Met Sally?
I have.
You know the scene where she fakes the orgasm?
I I should, by the sounds of it.
It's a very famous scene where she's at this deli and she's talking to Billy Crystal and she says, "All women fake it." And he's like, "I would know if a woman fakes it." And she has this very robust fake orgasm in this deli, and it's the deli that I work at.
Oh yeah.
Uh, it's called Katz's. It's 135 years old. It's probably the most famous deli in the world.
Hmm.
Donnie Brasco was shot there. When Harry Met Sally was shot there. Fucking, they did Impractical Jokers there. A million things,
Mm-hmm.
but um, when I was there, I had this vision of doing a show about Katz's called Behind the Counter. Everyone that works at Katz's is, I mean, 98% of everyone that works at Katz's is Dominican, and they're really funny and they're really old school New York. And I wanted to make a show about them and
Mm-hmm.
call it Behind the Counter because I was a big Behind the Music fan and I thought Behind the Counter would be a funny show. But it
Mm-hmm.
turned out that once I put a camera on them, they were totally cheesy and not good. And I was like, fuck, how am I going to make a show out of it? And I decided that I was going to make the show about me. And then they could just make fun of me because they always did. And so the show became called The Last Jewish Waiter. And it was about a waiter who hates waiting tables and wants to have a talk show. So he does the talk show while he waits tables. And we did 3 episodes of it, and it got a ton of press. Like USA Today wrote about it, and the Huffington Post wrote about it, and New Yorker wrote about it. And Chris, who I had met in treatment, who I started Dopey with, was like, "I want to do something like that." And I was like, "Well, I don't know what that would be." And then I had this other friend I'd remembered years ago who was like, "We should do a podcast about drug stories." And I'm like, "What's a podcast?" And he's like, "Oh, it's like a radio show." And I was like, okay." And I was high, and I was like, and he made one, and he sent it to me, and it was like celebrities telling drug stories, and my friend kind of introducing like stories that had been on other shows. Like he
Okay.
curated other stories, he put them together, and he's like, "That's going to be my podcast." And I was like, I was too high to really understand what he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And but I remembered the idea. And Chris was like one of the funniest people I had ever met, and one of the worst drug addicts, and had just funny, stupid drug stories. So Chris was like, "I want to do something like The Last Jewish Waiter." And I had just gotten sober, and I was talking to him on a daily basis. And I was like, "Okay, well, why don't we do something then?" Because I knew I needed something to do. Like, I just needed something to fucking do. I was in a band, but our band sucked, and I
What'd you
didn't
play?
enjoy it. I played guitar and sang and stuff. I
Mm.
didn't enjoy, like, the band wasn't working, and I knew the band wasn't going to work, and I didn't like late nights really, and I always was a crazy Howard Stern show fan,
Mm.
and all of a sudden it just started clicking in my head. I was like, we can do a show about the worst drug stories that we ever thought of. And Chris was like, "Let's do it." And he's like, "What do we do?" And I was like, "Come to my apartment." And Chris lived in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and I lived on the Lower East Side of New York. And I said, "Come to my apartment and we'll record." And he said, "Okay." And he drove down, and I was 41 and he was 31. And he came to my house and he's like, "What do we do?" And I just knew what I wanted to do. And we didn't have any gear. And I told him not to buy any gear because I
Mm-hmm.
had it in my head that if we bought any gear, we would never do the show. It would be another thing that we said we would do that we would never do.
Yeah.
And instead, we both had MacBook Pros, and I had recorded some songs using the mic on the MacBook Pro. So I knew that was doable. So
Mm-hmm.
we just talked into the computer. Um, we did, I think, 4 episodes the first time he sat down. And I think the first time he came, we were talking about what the show should be called. And we had had maybe 3 or 4 conversations about what the show should be called. And
Mm-hmm.
we were like, it's going to be called War Stories. That's the
Mm.
name of the show, 100%. And the show is only going to be War Stories. And if people don't like it, fuck them. I don't care. Like, we were both in 12 Step, and they don't like War Stories in 12 Step. And
Yeah.
everyone says, I don't like War Stories. And I said, well, this is the show for people that like them. You know, we liked them. We thought they were funny and stupid and just absurd. And and then we Chris is at my apartment, and he's like typing in, like, to get a hosting thing, whatever, and he types in War Stories, and there was a podcast called War Stories, like, about real war stories, like the Korean War, or like
Yeah.
World War II or whatever. And
Yeah.
he's like, and I'm like, and I remembered, like, that morning I was walking home from the deli, and there was some kid on Clinton Street, some Spanish kid, wearing a black baseball hat with gold letters. And I don't mean just like gold printed letters, like letters made of gold attached to the hat. And it
Mm-hmm.
said dope. And I was like, and I looked at this kid, and I grew up in the 90s. You know what I mean? I came of age in the 90s, and dope was a great word. I loved hip hop music. That shit is dope. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I loved that thing. I love that idea. That shit is dope. That shit is dope. And then when I became a heroin addict, hearing heroin described as dope or weed described as dope, I was like, that's such an interesting word. And I look at the kid, and all of a sudden my grandfather pops in my head. And my grandfather was like an old timey New York City Jew, he's a tough guy. And if he had seen this kid on the street, he would have been like, "Who's this fucking dope?" You know what I mean? Like,
Mm.
who's this fucking idiot? And then I was like, that's such an interesting word. And then I thought of the word dopey, but because, like, Howard Stern is like, your dopey story, your dopey this, like, in the derogatory kind of way.
Yeah.
And Chris said maybe we should call it Two Dopes Talking About Dope. And I was like, no, let's just call it Dopey. And it just stuck. And
Mm.
and after Chris died, right? Chris died
Yeah.
while we made the show, and after he died, people started calling me Dopey Dave, and that's the only time I've regretted the name Dopey, because I never wanted to be Dopey Dave, and I still, if anyone calls me Dopey Dave, I, like, stop them. Like, I will not own Dopey Dave. I don't like it.
So I should change the file name on this
Yes.
recording then? Yes. Okay.
No, you can call the file name Dopey Dave,
Yeah.
but on the show you can say Dave from Dopey or David
Yes.
Manheim from Dopey Podcast. But no, so,
Yes.
like, I loved the name Dopey, and I thought it was the perfect
Mm-hmm.
name for our show. And
Mm.
If Chris had lived, I would never have become Dopey Dave. Wouldn't have been Dopey Dave and Dopey Chris. It would have just been Dopey, guys from
Yeah.
Dopey.
So tell us then, how long into the show were you before Chris passed?
He died after our 142nd episode.
Mm-hmm.
We were 2.5 years in. It was our 5th year anniversary of his death, so he died in 2018. And we had a lot of death in the show. There was a guy. I mean, there's a lot of people that died who were in the show. Like, there was a guy named Dave Marshall who had a CrossFit gym, who had set up our Facebook page. He died. There was a couple of listeners who wrote us emails about themselves, and their families informed us that they died. One of my very best friends, who I kind of came up using with, the kid who actually was on crystal meth when I moved to LA, he died. And when he died, I, like, lost it. Like, and he died in the summer of 2018. My wife and I had just bought our first house. Like, we had gotten back together, in after Dopey started, and we had
Mm-hmm.
had a second daughter, and our second daughter was born in May of 2018, and in June of 2018, my best friend died, and then in July of 2018, Chris died, and it was beyond traumatic,
Mm-hmm.
like, just a miserable awakening to what almost the hubris that we had in making the show in the first place. You
Mm.
know, we were making fun of addiction, and then it kills half the listeners. You know what I'm saying?
How did that change the way you did the show? Because I mean, what you just talked about was, we're making fun of addiction all day long, and yet it's killing half the people. It sounds like you had a bit of an awakening there. How did that change how you produced the show?
Well, after my friend died, Chris was relapsing, but I didn't know it.
Mm.
And the show kind of changed then. And I remember it fairly well that we got a story from somebody, like some story about like fake urine or, what would have been just a normal, stupid, funny story that we would have laughed about. And Chris said something, and I said something to him like, I don't really think that's funny anymore. And he
Mm.
said, What do you mean? And I said, Well, I think everything changed when Todd died. And for me, everything did change when Todd died. And I wasn't like, the show is still funny. It's different. There's a lot of comedy in Dopey still, but it just needs, like, the consequences need to be acknowledged. And when we talked about laughing the survivors laugh, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that's okay. But really what needs to be transmitted is the only way you get to stay sober is by putting work in. That's the
Mm-hmm.
only real way it's guaranteed. And I think that was added to the show um, by means of the reality that the creator was dead, that the co-creator was gone. So like that for the first year he died, like I think I talked about him being gone every day. Now 5 years later, I do 2 tribute shows to him every year. I mention him every episode.
Mm-hmm.
Our Instagram page still says Dave and Chris. Our Twitter says Dave and Chris because him not being on the show is really relevant to the show's existence, no matter how far the show goes or no matter what the show is. Um, so I think the show's changed mostly in that I had to figure out how to manage a show without him,
Mm-hmm.
which became an interview show, which became rotating guest hosts, which became um, I mean, in a lot of ways, it became whatever I wanted it to be. Whereas when he was alive, it was me and him being funny, like, and I would never trade it, but I wasn't going to give it up once he died either, because it's what I had always wanted to do.
Mm. When you when you started the show, did you have aspirations, or was this just something that you were going to just do on the side and have fun with? Maybe help some people.
Well, it's funny, like, it was never about helping people. And I'm
Mm.
not even sure it is about helping people now at all.
Mm.
I think,
That's a bold statement. That's not
I
usually what
know.
you hear.
I think when we started it, we did it so we'd have something to do,
Mm-hmm.
and we did it so we'd have fun. And then both of us were total addicts, which we were the piece of shit at the center of the universe. You know, what is it? What's the expression? Egomaniacs with low self-esteem, all that kind of stuff. So like
Yeah.
on one hand we were like Dopey's nothing, but on the other hand we were like, this could be the biggest show ever, blah blah
Mm-hmm.
blah, you know what I mean? So like
Yeah.
Dopey has almost 11 million downloads on it now. I've had Jamie Lee Curtis on, I've had Mark Maron on a few times, we had Killer Mike from Run the Jewels, I've had Gabor Mate, Dr. Drew is a regular, Margaret Cho is a fan and a regular. Like the show is, it's not a huge podcast, but it's a pretty, it's bigger than it's a, I always call it a large insect in the animal kingdom, you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Yeah.
of podcasts. It's a really substantial insect.
Yeah.
And I have aspirations of it being much bigger,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that it helps people. I know that, but the way I look at it is my responsibility is to make Dopey the best show. Excuse me. My responsibility is to make Dopey the best show that I can make it, right? And if I do that, the side effects of that are that people enjoy it. And
Mm.
if people enjoy it, if they feel like they want to listen to it and they want to spend however much time with me in the doposphere, dopeyverse, whatever you want to call it, one of the greatest side effects is, wow. I mean, when me and Chris were alive, when Chris was alive, it was, wow, those guys are obviously having fun and they're sober. And like, so that's the way I want to be helpful. It's like they can listen to the show and they can be like, wow, Dave is obviously enjoying making this show and he's sober.
Mm.
And you know, that's if I made a show, this is something that Chris said, and I still stand by it. If we made a show designed to help people, it would help nobody and it would suck. You know?
Yeah.
So if we tried to make a good show, maybe somebody will get something out of it and it could be good. And that's where I stand with the whole thing.
Mm. At the beginning of the show, we spoke briefly about talking about getting through the holiday seasons, and we didn't talk about that at all. So we should probably hit
I
on that a little.
apologize.
That's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. I'm hosting. You're the one talking. I should be on top of these things. So I'm sorry.
It's all right. Okay.
But tell us, like, what was it like coming into your first few holiday seasons? I know you're Jewish. I know you know, don't really do the Christmas thing, but you know, the holiday season
No, I
affects
do.
us all.
I do the Christmas thing. My wife is
Okay.
not Jewish. My kids are not Jewish.
Okay.
And I also love Christmas. Even
Mm.
when I wasn't with a non-Jew, I always celebrated Christmas with people every year since I
Mm-hmm.
was 5. And growing up in you know, New York City is a very Jewish place, but it's still not a Jewish society. So
Mm-hmm.
Christmas has always loomed large. And the holiday season for me has never been about Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever. It's just been about, like, when I used, it was like there's extra money and there's no accountability and everybody's a little fucked up anyway, so I could go deep. And me going deep would be leaving and never coming back, never showing up in the first place. Um, in the beginning, the holidays were very uncomfortable,
Mm.
and I needed to stay as connected to other people in recovery as I could. And what I really needed to do was know that it's okay to feel uncomfortable, that it will pass. And,
Mm.
and then also, like, maximize whatever pleasure I could when I could. And if that was eating or movies or TV or sex or any good thing that or hang out with friends or playing a game or anything, do that. Keep my mind as stimulated as I possibly could. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the secret to all recovery, is be as active and connected as you can so you don't get stuck up there.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say up there, if you're listening, your brain.
Yes. Yes. All right, Dave. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks for sharing some of your story with us and how Dopey podcast came to be. We'll let you go. Take care, my friend.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, hang on. Here's one more story, Dopey style.
I had a production job in Los Angeles working on a commercial for toothpaste. I was smoking a bunch of meth at the time. So they gave me this box. And you know, in a toothpaste commercial, how like the toothpaste looks perfect on top of the toothbrush?
I can smell it.
They made those out of porcelain. And for some reason, they called them nurdles. And I was responsible for the nurdles. I was smoking a bunch of meth and I had this box of nurdles, and I'm smoking meth and I'm smoking weed. I don't know why I had this thought, but I was like, I need to hide the meth while I'm on set. Like, I can't keep it in my pocket because I'm crazy on meth. So I take the meth and the pipe and I put it in the box with the nurdles, but I don't even realize it. And I hide it, okay, on the set, under a sink, in a bathroom. Then the director is setting off all the lights. It takes hours. And then they're like, okay, where's the nurdles? And I had forgotten that I had the nurdles and that I had hid them. We start searching for the nurdles, and I had totally spaced that I had them and hid them. And then I was like, oh yeah, I remember I put them there, but I forgot that I had put the meth in with the nurdles. So I retrieve the box of Nurdles and I hand it to the director, who finds the meth, and I'm promptly fired. And I try to explain that it wasn't my meth. I just put weed in the box.
I was just holding it for my friend.
It was so embarrassing because it was such a good job, and like there was some like a beautiful girl on craft services that I became friends with, and I was flirting with her, and it seemed like that was going well. And then the next thing I know, I'm fired because they found meth with the Nurdles. Horrible.
And she wasn't into meth, or
She wasn't into a loser drug addict getting fired on the set of a commercial. You know, she might have been into the meth, but besides that, no.
Yeah. Well, did you ask?
Say, this is Hard Knocks Talks.